Welcome back to the Sticky Art channel. If you're new here, my name is Justin, and in this video, I'm going to show everything you need to know how to use Posca markers. I also want to share some tips and tricks that I found using the Posca markers to get the best results, as well as some tips for blending. But first, for anyone who does not know what a Posca marker is, it is a paint pen that uses a high-quality water-based acrylic paint. It is non-toxic, super versatile, and easy to take on the go. One of the things I really like about these markers is how opaque the paint is. It has a really heavy pigment load, making it really easy to get good coverage. Because of how opaque the paint is, it only takes 1 to 2 layers to get full coverage. And they come in a variety of pen tip sizes, from a PCF 350 that is a brush tip, great for doing lettering and stylized lines, to a PC 1MR for super small details, all the way to the middle PC 5M, which is one of my personal favorites. It's the most versatile out of all of them. You can use it for almost anything from filling to small details. And then all the way up to the PC 17K, super thick marker that is great for filling in large areas. And a lot of street artists like to use these just because of it being a large block type tip, great for doing block letters and straight lines. Posca markers come in a total of 66 colors, including 8 metallic, 6 fluorescent, and 8 glitter. In the US, there are a little bit less selection of colors. There's only 55 total colors. There are some missing from the base set. But even with 55 colors, I feel like there is ample colors kind of mix and match together, get some really nice combinations and palettes going, and all of the colors are really well selected and they're harmonized so they work really well together. Posca markers will work on a variety of surfaces, including wood, fabric, glass, ceramic, paper, plastic, metals, minerals, and even canvas. This makes them great for customizing pretty much anything that you can think of, and on their website there is a reference that you can go off of that have tips and tricks for each surface. And for the most part, they'll work on pretty much anything that is smooth and flat. If it is more porous, like rocks or even cloth, it is going to soak into it more. So there are some special things that you need to do to prep the area. And in some cases with rocks, you just need to use more coats of the paint because it will soak into the actual rock. The paint itself is pretty durable once it is completely dry. However, if you want something that is longer lasting and has more of a permanent and protective coat on there, you can always apply a water-based varnish. And depending on the look that you want to go for, you can either go with a shiny varnish or even a matte varnish to match more of the paint. And the paint by itself, if you do not apply anything, will have more of a matte look to it. When getting started with a new Posca marker, the first thing you're going to need to do is to activate the pen. And to do this, you'll want to shake the pen first with the cap on vigorously for about 30 seconds to 1 minute. This is going to make sure that the paint inside is all mixed up and there's not any air bubbles. Once you have the pen shaken up, go ahead and take the cap off. The marker that I'm using to demonstrate how to activate a Posca marker is a PC 5M. This marker has a bullet tip nib. It is double-sided, so if you do end up damaging one side or wearing down a little bit on one side, you can always flip it over. So to get started with this, you want to go ahead and turn the marker upside down. If it's not upside down, the paint's not going to come out. But once it is upside down, you can compress the tip. And I recommend just pressing down a little first few times. If you press all the way down, it most likely will drop a little extra paint, and you want to keep pressing up and down until the pen tip is fully saturated with the paint. One thing to keep in mind when activating a new Posca marker is to do it on a spare piece of paper rather than on your final piece of artwork or something that you're working on. Just in case when you press down the tip, if you press it down too fast or for too long, sometimes too much paint will come out and flood the area. And if you're on a spare piece of paper, it's not going to really matter. You can actually dip the tip into the paint while it's still wet and then use it on whatever you're going to draw. When using Posca markers to paint on paper, it's important to keep in mind that the paint is water-based, so you want to use a paper that is intended for a wet medium or even watercolor paper. And even with that in mind, the nibs on the Posca markers are a little bit on the rougher side, so if you go over an area that is wet, even on watercolor paper or wet medium paper, it will tend to destroy the paper a little bit and collect a little bit of that paper, as well as cause some pilling. A couple tips that I have for avoiding damaging the paper would be, first off, use a light touch when using the marker on paper. The nibs are a little bit rough, and if you use too much pressure, it has a tendency to tear up the paper. And the second would be to only go over an area once, and if you don't get enough coverage or the coverage amount that you'd like, let it fully dry and then come back over it with a second coat. This will allow the paint to dry, creating a protective barrier on the paper itself, rather than going over an area of paper where it's wet, and you'll be able to get some really nice coverage this way. My next set of tips is for blending the different Posca marker colors. And since the paint is essentially acrylic paint, you can use water to dilute it, and using either a paintbrush that is either a watercolor or acrylic paintbrush with a little bit of water, make sure that it's damp or even more on the wet side. You can play around with the colors and mix them as long as they're still wet. Another way to blend the markers is to treat the paint like it is acrylic paint and just put it on the palette either like that or like a watercolor and dilute it with water. And then you can go in with the different colors. You can even pre-mix the colors where you want it to be more blended on the actual palette rather than on the work. And this will give you a nice smooth gradient. And you can always come back after it has dried and add more layers to get more coverage. The same process of letting the first coat dry and coming back with a second coat works as well with the markers. In fact, I found that it works really well to blend on top of the first coat because you have a layer of protection between the paper and the pen tip. And it also just makes it a little bit easier to move everything around and blend it. And you can also mix the two different techniques of using the markers on the paper as well as using a brush. If you don't have a paintbrush available, you can still blend with using just the markers using a wet on wet technique as well. And it's just like it sounds. You want to make sure that you use one marker, get the paint down, make sure that it's wet, and then come back with the other marker while both paints are still wet and mix the two. This is a really easy way to mix the paint as long as you work fast, just because the paint dries really quick. If you're using this technique on paper, you do want to make sure not to overwork the paper or the paint, just because when the paper is so wet, it is really easy to damage. However, if you're using this technique on other surfaces that are not as easily worn down, this technique works really well and you're able to work the paint a little bit more and get some really smooth blends. I'm using a similar wet on wet technique with a rainbow of colors. This time I'm not going to blend as much and I'm just letting the two markers where they meet kind of do their own blending. This gives a still blended effect, but it is a lot harder of a gradient. When using this process of mixing and blending the colors, I have found that some of the lighter colors tend to hold on to some of the darker colors if you use them right next to each other or blend with them. And to get rid of this or get back to the original color, all you'll need to do is clean the tip. And it's really easy to clean the tip on Posca markers. All you'll need to do is get a paper towel or a damp towel with a wet spot and a dry spot. And you want to dab a few times in the wet spot and then dab on the dry side to just dry it off. And go ahead on a blank piece of paper or scratch paper, you can go and test out and make sure that it is clean and back to the original color. My last set of tips and tricks are how to get professional long-lasting results using Posca markers on a wooden skateboard deck. And I actually painted this board on another video. If you want to see the full process, you can check out that. I'll put a link to that video in the video description below. But in this video, I'm just going to go over the main steps in the process and the main tips and tricks to get the results. And I'm going to start off by prepping the board by sanding it down with a 300 grit sandpaper. This allows the paint to have something to stick to, as well as getting off anything that is uneven. After that, I come back and wipe everything down using a towel with some rubbing alcohol on it. Just make sure I get rid of any oil or any residue that's on the board. Next, I'm going to come back in and sketch everything out, get my design down, and before coming in with a paint, I'm going to come in with a Liquitex Professional Gesso. This acts as a primer. This is what I use mainly in my acrylic paint, pretty much everything, just because it acts as a really good base, and you can sand it down even more and get it even smoother. And this will also cover up any leftover wood grain texture or any unevenness, and also acts as a barrier in between the wood and the paint. I found that painting on bare wood or wood that has not had a layer of gesso, sometimes if you paint too thick with a Posca marker, you'll actually get the paint will crack because the wood soaks up the moisture. So to avoid this, the gesso definitely is a good idea. And after the gesso is completely dried, I'm going to go ahead and sand it down. And with the Posca markers, the best way to get them down is just to go over with one coat. If you don't get full coverage the first time, it's definitely okay. And it's better to just let it fully dry and then come back in with a second coat than try and mess around with it and try and get it, because it ends up getting too blotchy. Once the painting is completed and fully dry, I'm going to come back in with 2 coats of matte varnish. This is going to give the board and painting an even coat, make it look nice and smooth, as well as give it an added level of protection. And that about wraps up my tips and tricks for getting started with Posca markers and getting the best results. If you do have any other questions, let me know in the comment section below. And if you did enjoy this video, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, as well as check out my other art videos and tutorials, and subscribe and turn on post notifications for when I post my newest videos. And until next time, peace.